NG Houston. Happy New Year. So welcome to 2019. I'm super excited. I missed you guys, and I'm glad to see everybody. We have actually a really great crowd. Oh, I always forget to mute this thing, and I'm fixing to hear myself talk again. Okay. Sorry about that. I always do that. You'd think I would learn. Anyway, so we have a great crowd watching tonight. We have some familiar faces in the chat, and I'm happy to see y'all. And we also have Brian Love and Kevin Schuchard. Did I say it right? Kevin Schuchard?
Close. Schuchard. That's all right.
Schuchard. Because there's another C in there. That's why I got confused. See?
Yep.
Everybody does that.
That's second one.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm glad it's not just me. So yeah, you guys are talking about, well, I just asked you to come on and teach us something cool. And what are you guys going to teach us that's cool tonight?
Yeah, we're going to be talking about Angular Schematics today.
Love it. Love it, love it, love it. Okay, so we have a bunch of people watching, and if you guys have any questions, just go ahead and drop them in the chat, and we'll try to get them answered. And in the meantime, I'm just going to let you guys take it and run with it.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, you have slides? You want to share your screen?
Yeah, I do have slides. And where's the present button? There it is.
I should probably turn on my Bluetooth so that you guys don't hear all the background noise.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
It's over to here. Okay, great. You can still see it?
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming out tonight and for hanging out with us for the next, whatever, 45 minutes or an hour as we kind of talk through Angular Schematics. This presentation is targeted, certainly towards people that have heard about schematics. If you've been at NGConf the last year or maybe even 2 years, I guess, well, it came out in 6, maybe the last year, you've kind of heard this buzz around schematics and the possibilities that come with schematics, and you might also know that it helps drive some of the Angular CLI when you're doing things like generating components or generating modules and these kinds of things. And you might have also heard that schematics allow you to add new packages to your Angular project using ng-add, or maybe updating existing packages or libraries in your Angular projects using ng-update. What we're going to do is we're going to kind of pull back the cover a little bit here today. We're going to take a look at what schematics are, and we're going to go through a couple of demos with you and show you how you can get started with building schematics. But before we get into that, let's quickly introduce ourselves. So I am Brian Love, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer here for Brebug. We're a fairly small consulting company here in Denver, and we work with clients and medium and large enterprises here in Denver and what we call the Front Range, so kind of the economic hub of Colorado. We work with clients doing Angular projects. Pretty much solely Angular, although we have done a couple other things on the front end world as well. And so I get the opportunity of working with a really great group of engineers as we work on those projects. And then I also get to work with a great guy, Jesse Sanders, who's also—
We love Jesse Sanders.
Yeah.
You guys had such a crazy, like, Brebug is everywhere in 2018.
Yeah, man, we're killing it.
I started asking people, have you heard of Jesse Sanders? And everybody, all of a sudden, everybody's like, oh yeah, Jesse Sanders. Yeah, I love that guy.
That's awesome.
Yeah, he's lovable.
Yeah, and so Jesse's our CEO and founder. And so I get to work very closely with Jesse kind of on strategy and leading the team here at Brebug. And so that's myself. And Kevin, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Kevin Schuchard. I'm a developer here at Brebug, and I've been here for a few years now. And recently, I've been able to work quite a bit on schematics. So learned a few things the hard way, and have produced a couple open source libraries we might talk about a little bit later. But have had the opportunity to write a few schematics. So excited to be talking about them today.
Cool. So let's go ahead and get started. I think the first question that you ought to ask yourself, perhaps, and certainly the first question that I get asked a lot when I talk about schematics with people in the Angular community is, not just what, but why. So, sure, schematics, they, help drive the CLI. When I generate out a component, that's great. I love it. CLI is awesome. Certainly hat off to Hans and Mike Brockie and all the people that are working hard on the CLI. But why would I want to actually dive into schematics myself, right? And so I think there's a couple of reasons, and we've got them here outlined on our slides. But first and foremost, we want to talk about, dry, right? So not repeating yourself. You might find yourself, as a developer working along on either maybe just one project or many projects or whatever it is that you're, in your team or your organization. And you're like, man, I keep doing this same task over and over. And that task may be short. Maybe it just takes you, 5-10 minutes, or maybe it's 20 or 30 minutes. But it's also tedious, right? And it also could be prone to error. Maybe it's something that you're kind of duplicating out, whether that's maybe like a logging implementation or something like that, across your applications. And so you can use schematics to automate what you're doing, right? So you can use schematics to do whatever those series of steps are that are kind of tedious that you're going through, time and time again. And you can programmatically, create a schematic that will do that for you and do it consistently and correctly every time, right? The other reason why you might be interested in building a schematic is you want to enforce architecture and consistency at the organization. Maybe you work for a very large company and there's, several teams that are all doing Angular and front-end development, and you want to enforce a specific architecture or a pattern, and you want that to be consistent, and you want it to be implemented correctly across multiple applications. If you're not using a monorepo, or if you are using a monorepo, you want to enforce that architecture in those implementations and those applications. And so again, we can build a schematic that allows us to programmatically implement that architecture consistently in your organization. And then next, you might be adding or updating libraries. They may be your own library. If you're a library author and you're interested in making it really easy for people to add your library to their Angular application, you might be interested in learning schematics. So that way, an Angular developer can simply do ng-add, my favorite lib, and it installs it, it configures it, it wires everything up, and you're up and running. And we see that in projects today, like obviously Angular Materials got an ng-add schematic. And then I believe NativeScript, I think, has one. I know Ionic does. And
NGRX?
NGRX, there you go. Yeah, there's another example, right? And so as a library author or maybe a contributor to a library, you're interested in making it easy for developers to add that library. And then, of course, the update is really cool because, as Angular kind of evolves and grows up, we can have ng update. So that way, when I update Angular, all of my those libraries that I'm using, like NGRX, for example, right? If there's any necessary updates, we can make it really seamless for developers to update that library for whatever changes need to be made. Whatever breaking changes need to be implemented as part of that update process. And then last, if you're thinking to yourself, well, maybe these don't really apply to me, but I'm still interested in schematics. Maybe you're interested in actually contributing open source, right? And that's something that to help yourself grow and learn as a developer. And maybe you want to create a schematic for something out there. Like Kevin did a schematic for Prettier. So it makes it really easy for developers to add Prettier to their Angular project. He's obviously not the author of Prettier, but he wanted to contribute to the open source community and to the Angular community specifically, and contribute in that way. So that's a couple of reasons why you might be interested in schematics. But before we dive in real quick, I want to make it really, really clear that schematics are not Angular, right? So we're going to show some code, and we've got some demos here for you guys today. But schematics, you're not going to see an at component decorator, right? We're not going to be building an Angular application. Schematics are TypeScript library that we're going to be using that can create Angular things, if you will, in air quotes, but they're not actually Angular. So if you're an Angular developer, I think this is a really fun thing to learn about, because you might know a lot about Angular, but this is kind of something that you can add to your tool belt and help you to become a better Angular developer. And so with that, Kevin, why don't we dive into some frequently asked questions?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So yeah, let's take a kind of a high overview look real quick of what schematics are, and so we can kind of get the right context before we jump into some of the lower level code. So right off the bat, what are schematics? If you're new to this, you're probably, this is probably your main question. And I like to think of them as generally a collection of transformations that you can apply to a file system. So you may be new to all this, and maybe you've seen libraries or projects like Yeoman generators. They were very popular for a while, and there's still a lot out there. Kind of similar to that, or if you're from the React community, JS CodeShift is another similar project and library out there, but they're basically going to allow you to create rules and apply those to your file system in various ways. And so when we start talking about what do they do, generally most of the common things are going to be examples like adding and updating libraries, modifying your file system code, adding files to your file system. So we can create files from scratch. We can create files that have dynamic properties. For example, we can pass a file path into a file and have it parameterized or modified in the appropriate manner. And then we can remove files. We can copy them, move them around. Really do a lot of really powerful things pretty easily. And like Brian said, what we're going to be talking about today is there's not going to be a lot of Angular involved in the actual schematic code. What we're working on is going to be Angular specific, but when you're actually writing the schematic files, it's really going to be more geared towards the schematic library, which we'll talk about, and then just your basic TypeScript ecosystem. And when it comes to using schematics, for the majority of people, this is going to be in the Angular CLI with the ng command. So if you run ng add and pass it a library, that will generally install that as a dependency and then run whatever the library maintainer has set up as the default schematic to run. And same thing for generate. You can pass a specific schematic collection to that. And also, Brian mentioned if a library maintainer has specified an update schematic, when you run that update command, their schematic will get picked up in that group of updates and apply their transformation to your file system as well. And so next, we're going to look at a kind of example of a container component with schematics.
Cool. Bonnie, should we maybe pause here? I don't know if you got any questions in the live chat.
No, everybody's just kind of hanging on. The one thing I wanted to say, I think it's is it Angular 1.6 that has the ng add, ng update feature that came out? Was it with 1.6 or I mean with it 1.6? What am I? I'm back in 2015. I'm sorry, I've been off for holidays. I forgot all my Angular.
1.6.
It's Angular version 6.
Yeah.
I don't know where I got 1.6 because I've been away from the computer too long and I'm crazy, you guys. I've been on vacation too long. But yeah, so I think it's Angular version 6 that enabled the update. And so now you can do ng add, which I was very, very, very excited about because I can't believe how easy this makes things.
Yeah, I believe you're correct, Bonnie. I'd have to double check to be sure, but I believe 6. That's when they introduced the Angular.json file.
Yes.
Along with
super. And you guys are going to actually show us how to do this and what the code looks like.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going back on mute. You guys rock on.
Okay, so we're going to do a quick demo. So the idea here, and we're going to look at the code, but I've given this presentation a couple times, both here in Denver and Boulder, as well as up in Portland. And one of the feedback I got is like, okay, well, you know, all along I know what their end result is. So that's what I'm going to do first here. So let me show you one demo. And so the idea here is, you know, one of the things I talked about with like do not repeat yourself with dry is I found myself, we are pretty strict in that we follow the component architecture of doing stateless and stateful components, right? Some people call them container components and presentation components. But the idea here is that, your container component or your stateful component knows about the state of the application, right? And that's often where, if we're using NGRX, that's where we're going to inject the store, or we might inject a service into that container component. And it's kind of dealing with that data and dealing with the state and that kind of thing. And so oftentimes when I'm creating a container, what I call a container component, is I need to do a couple of things, right? I'm going to import from RxJS the subject, as well as the take until operator. That's my preferred way to kind of deal with subscriptions. And then I'll create a new private variable that's a subject. I'll implement the onDestroy interface for the lifecycle method. And then in
Kevin, we still see a slide that says NGG Schematics. Are you on a different screen?
Yeah, hold on. I'm kind of talking through this, and then I'll show you the demo.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, and so these are the things that I'm kind of doing, right, in this container component.
Right.
And so I wanted to create a schematic that just did that all for me, right? So it's basically an extension of build, like ng, generate component. So it's that same idea of generating a component, only there's going to be a couple additional things in there that make it easy, so that way I can get started real quickly with dealing with observables and with NGRX, right? So let me show you what we're going to do. Is first thing we're going to do is we're going to clone out this repo, which I've already done. And I've already done the yarn install and installed in my Sandbox. And we'll talk a little bit about the Sandbox later. Actually, Kevin will. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to build my schematic, and then I'm going to run this test command. And we should see in VS Code, we're going to see this get created. So let me go ahead and switch over.
I was getting all worried. I was like, wait, I don't see
No,
you haven't started it. Hold on, Bonnie.
Let me go ahead and bump this a little bit for you. All right, can you see VS Code?
I can.
All right, so we're not going to look at the source yet for the schematic, but let's look in here. You can see that this is a Angular application. I called it Sandbox, and all that's been done to it, excuse me, is ng new Sandbox, and that's it. Right, so it's just a ready to go Angular application. And what I want to do is I want to create a new component in my application that's going to be this container component, if you will, right? And so let me pull up my terminal. Let me bump that as well. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and build our schematic. And so this is just going to run the TypeScript compiler, and it's going to create our schematic for us. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run yarn test. And what is going to happen here is in the Sandbox, I'm first going to check out head and clean the Sandbox. And then inside the Sandbox, I'm going to run this ngg command to generate out this new schematic that we've created, right? And then we're going to learn how to create. And so I'm going to get prompted here, what name would you like to use for the component? And we'll go ahead and call this the Houston component. Oh, right. This happens to me. Sorry. You can never have a demo go perfect, right? I mean, come on.
It's like a rule. If you're live coding on YouTube, something has
to
go
has
wrong.
to happen.
It's the law of the universe.
Let's try it again here. So it's what we're doing is basically just resetting that Angular application. And then we're going to run this generate command, and we're going to call this Houston and hit enter. And then you can see, I'm going to go ahead and kill this because we don't need to do the linting and testing and everything here. But we can see that a bunch of files were created. And I don't know why this one gets created. But anyways, we can see that we created these Houston components based on the name of the component that I got prompted with. And so now if I come into my app, I can see here's my Houston component. And like I was talking about, you'll see that, wow, this looks a lot like just a standard vanilla Angular component, but it's kind of wired up and ready to go in terms of dealing with observables, right? So I've got my subject here that I'm creating, and I've implemented importing onDestroy and subject and take until, and then here's my onDestroy and my interface. And then I go ahead and next that and complete it. And then I can use that for any observable stream that I have in the pipe. I can take until and then pass it this unsubscribe subject, right? So it's a pretty simple example. But this is something that I found myself kind of doing repeating, this code over and over and over again. And I was like, hey, this is a perfect example where I could build a schematic and just make my life easier. So with that, that is kind of the demo. And then we're going to get back into actually how we're going to build this all out. All right. You want to talk a little bit about configuration first and how we can configure schematics?
Sure. Yeah, so when you're starting with schematics, even with just the Angular CLI, we were just talking a little bit about the angular.json file. They introduce the ability to set defaults for your schematic collection. So if you find yourself, let's say take the component schematic, for example. If you find yourself, constantly using, let's say, SCSS in your application, you'll probably note that the Angular CLI defaults to CSS. So you'll probably find yourself passing the style extension flag and then, equals SCSS over and over. But for all these schematics that you see listed here, we can set defaults for these angular.json file. So here's an example of the angular.json file. And we're kind of looking at the root of this JSON object, and you'll see we have a projects key, and then in that project, we'll have the app that we're working with, and then a schematics key. So if we dive into that, we will then get into our schematic collection name. So we can see under schematics, we have @schematics/Angular component. So this is where we can configure the defaults for our schematics. So for example, if anytime we ran ng generate component and then passed it a name, we would get these defaults for every schematic component. So we can set our style extension default. For example, here we always want inline styles and an inline template, and we want our change detection strategy to be on push. So this is just a great, easy way to kind of stop having to manually configure your schematics through the inline arguments. And here's another example with the module. We can say, I want routing with every module that I generate, and that's less example there. So that's just a quick win for defaults with schematics.
Cool, thanks, Kevin. All right, so before we actually start diving into building our first schematic, I think it's kind of helpful to also start with a little bit of terminology, so that way we're all on the same page, right? And so the first thing that we need to understand is this idea of a collection. So when you actually create a schematic, if you will, you're actually creating a collection of schematics, like plural, multiple, right? So I can have multiple schematics for a collection, right? So I could have my add schematic, I can have my update schematic, I can have my generate whatever schematic, and all these kinds of things, right? And you have multiple generate schematics, all in this idea of a collection. Just like when you go and you use like the NGRX schematics, you're using the collection of schematics. So as you can see, it's basically just a list of schematics metadata. And once we get into this here in a little bit, Kevin's going to show us how we actually wire up our collection using a JSON file. The next thing that we need to understand is this idea of a tree, right? And this is actually kind of a cool concept because this is where schematics perhaps is a little bit different than maybe some other code generators that you might have used previously, like Yeoman or something like that. Because this tree is kind of like a virtual file system, if you will, right? So it's a staging area for all of the changes that you're going to make in your schematic containing the original file system and then all these changes that you're going to apply to it. And the nice thing about this is because it's kind of virtual, if you will, it's not until we actually commit all of our changes that those changes to the file system actually occur. And that's a really nice thing as for schematics in general, and then as a schematic developer, you can kind of think about this as like a SQL Server transaction, right? So if something happens earlier on in the transaction and I need to fail or I need to roll back all those changes that happened, that's the power of a schematic, right? So if something happens down the line, an error occurs, an exception occurs, we're not like caught in this kind of like bad state where we've made some changes but not all of the necessary changes. And so we'll be using the tree in order to create files and update files for our schematic. The next one that we need to know about is a rule. So a rule is a function that applies actions to the tree. So as you can see a rule is what we're going to be using, and we'll see this when we actually create our schematics. It gets 2 arguments to it. First, it gets the tree, which is kind of like the existing tree, if you will. And then it also gets the context, this schematic context object. Sometimes you'll see the tree also called a host. I'll just mention that in if you look at some of the source code for things like material, they might call it a host as well. The next thing that we need to know about is a source. So a source is a function that just creates an entirely new tree from an empty file system. So that allows us to create a new tree and then populate it from there. And then we have an action. So an action is this idea of an atomic operation. It's to be validated and committed to the file system or tree. And that's what we're going to be creating, these actions. With that, Kevin, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Yeah. Are there any questions real quick before we dive into the next section? All right, moving on.
Sorry, I was muted.
No worries.
No questions.
All right, good deal. All right, so let's kind of walk through how you might get up and running with building a schematic on your system. So first thing, obviously, we're going to do, we're going to want to install the Schematic CLI. And this is going to let us execute the schematic locally on our machine, as well as help us generate a starter project as well. And so once we install the Schematic CLI, we will have access to this schematics property here, this alias, so we can call schematics blank. Now, blank is a schematic that's provided by this CLI that we just installed. So that's going to help us generate out just a blank schematic. So we call schematics blank. We pass the name of our schematic. That will generate it out, similar to what you saw Brian when he ran his code from earlier. Then we will CD into that project, run the standard get init. And then one thing that we found helpful that I'll kind of touch on as a caveat later is that a lot of the things you'll find yourself doing are not necessarily maybe straightforward or something you've encountered with, because under the hood, and we may touch on this in a second, we're working with the abstract syntax tree from TypeScript. And so that comes with some kind of different ways of working with your file system. It brings a lot of power and functionality, but all that's to say that there are a lot of things that are kind of, common or simple to do, but are not necessarily straightforward when you're first figuring out. So these 2 packages have essentially figured a lot of those things out for you. Basically, this is kind of your utility treasure chest, if you will, of common methods and functionality that you want to do. So you can install these and require them as a dependency. However, we should make it known that you'll want to lock these versions down, because they are not
Public APIs.
They're not public
really,
APIs. Yeah. They haven't been blessed as being supported long term. So it's a great way to kind of see some examples and even use them and require them in your code. But the approved upon way for now is to copy these utility methods and commit them as your own file system, as your own file in your project. So a good resource, but just something to keep in mind as that may change in the future. So once we run this blank schematic, we're going to have a collection.json file. And this is going to be our map of all of our schematics that Brian mentioned earlier. So you can see under schematics, we have hello world. And just like Brian was saying, we can have n number of schematics within our collection here. So with this setup here, we would have a single schematic called hello world. And here we pass a description, and then we pass the path to the actual schematic code. And that's specified at the factory key right here. So we do the path and the hash, and then after the hash is the function name that we'll see that's exported in our TypeScript file. And then the schema is going to provide both validation and some additional features when you're running the schematic from the CLI. So if you've experienced the CLI command prompts that came out in 7, I believe, this is where you'll specify those prompts, which properties you want to be prompted for, and which defaults and validations and all those sorts of things. So we have covered our collection.json file. Let's take a look at the schema.json. So here we have our ID, our type, our title, and then within the schematic on the at least on the command line arguments, you'll generally have some sort of options that you may want configurable. This may be like a name or a path, or for example, we were looking at the component style extension. That would be a property in your schema.json. And so within that properties key, you can specify any number of keys that you want. And so we can, for example, say that our schematic has a name property. It is going to be a string type. And then here we can give it a default argument. So this is kind of a shortcut to pass this argument directly after the schematic. So if it's something that if your schematic is going to always require this property, you can specify it in this manner, and then you don't have to pass a dash name inline argument. You can just have it be the first argument inline there. And then we mentioned command prompts. This is how you specify command prompts. So it's actually really nice, really easy. This property here, xprompt, is what is displayed to the user of the schematic, and then it infers the properties within that schema property as well. So it knows that it needs to be a string, and then you can have required properties set. You can do some things like enums. So you can give them a list of properties to select from. There's a lot of really powerful, easy to configure CLI properties with this xprompt key here. And then, like I was saying, required is very easy to set up. It's just another property within that schema name field. And then, so now we've talked a lot. We've got a lot of examples holding that all in our mental model here, but we're finally have made it to some schematic code. And so we saw that the default path, we did that path to the file, then the hash, and then we had hello world. This is how we point our schematic collection name to a function. And so generally we point it to kind of an entry function, and then we can take it over from there with the rest of the logic. So we see we have a function that returns a rule, and we step down one below, and that returns another function that is passed a tree and a context. And so like Brian was saying, the schematics are, you're operating on a kind of a virtual file system, or kind of an in-memory application. So your schematic is going to read the file system, and then it's going to give you a representation of that in the form of a tree. And then we have a number of methods off of that tree that we can do things with. So in this example, there's a create method. You pass it a file name and then the contents that you want from that file name. And so we make that create call, and then we return the tree. So that's a very simple schematic there. And just to give an example of what this tree looks like, it has a number of methods. This is just a small subset of them, but we can do things like read into the tree, given it a certain path. We can see if things exist. We can create them like we just saw. Updates are a little different than creating. So we have this kind of begin and commit update, which I don't know if we're going to touch on.
Yeah, I think I will in a little bit, yeah.
So yeah, that's a little different. So there's a number of tree methods, that are available.
Now you showed it to us. You have to. You can't just tease us like that.
That's right.
Brian will answer all your questions.
No, Brian, yeah, nice.
So yeah, that is the tree. So since we
Can I jump in and stop you guys for a minute? Because my brain's getting a little scrambled, and I just want to make sure that I'm not missing anything.
Sure.
Because we were talking about setting up observables at the beginning.
Yep.
Am I getting ahead of ourselves again, or did I miss that?
We haven't looked at the source code of
That'll be the next demo, the next code that we look at. This is.
I always get ahead of it, see, because I get excited.
Yeah, it's coming. We're so close.
So you're setting up the structure so that you can go in and run that, and just kind of explaining like from the very beginning how this all works together, and then we're gonna go and actually write one.
Yeah, that Brian was kind of showing you like, here's what we're going to end up with, and then we kind of stepped back and said, here's how you'd start from the beginning. You use the Schematic CLI and set all these things up, and here are the pieces. And so we're getting close to that next section.
Yeah. All right, I'll stop bugging you.
All right. So once we have our schematic built and ready to go and ready to run it, we're going to, you can kind of put this together however you want. We have some opinions that we'll show you a little bit later on how to run this, but generally you're going to need to compile your TypeScript, right? So we're going to build the schematic so that it's executable locally. Then we use the Schematic CLI, calling schematics, and we will pass the collection and then a series of options. So I can break these down here just a little bit more. So the Schematic CLI accepts this argument here that's separated by a colon. The first property, that's actually just a period, just a dot, right? So we're saying run it at this path. So we're saying run it here where we're executing the CLI. So run the local schematic, and then we are passing the schematic name that we want to run. So in this example, hello world. And then the next argument is Houston. So we saw that default argument there. And then you can pass any number of arguments after that. So one thing to note, the Schematic CLI by default does not execute the schematic changes. It does not commit them to the tree and run them against your file system. So if you run your schematic without dry run false, it will show you essentially what it would have done, but you'll need to pass the dry run false flag for it to actually commit those changes and change your file system. So this is kind of the opposite of the Angular CLI, where you have to opt in to the dry run functionality in the CLI if you want to kind of see what it does.
So the dry run is true by default, which means if you don't put dry run false, I'm just repeating what you said to make sure that we're paying attention. That if you don't put dry run false, it's not actually going to do anything. It's just going to tell you what would have happened. And this is basically to protect you from yourself.
Yep. Yeah. It's kind of assuming like you're getting started with this. You're developing it locally. It's just a little safeguard, if you will, for now, that those are the defaults. So it'll show you the files that it has affected and what the effect was, whether it was create or update in your terminal. But it won't actually make those changes. So you'll need to do the dry run false for it to apply those changes.
Well, it's good if you forget. You can actually just do it again. So on this slide, line 2 and line 3 are pretty similar. Is this going to produce the same result, or are those slightly different?
Same result. So this is the Houston.
0.
Yeah, we showed that default argument where it was like, arg0. I'll quickly go back, but
yeah.
So this is two ways of passing the same thing, right? So since we said the position is 0 after the schematic, we say hello world and then Houston. So it knows that next argument is the name property. But you can also get to that in line 3 by just passing it as the name argument there.
Gotcha. So you're just showing us 2 different ways to do the same thing.
Exactly.
I gotcha.
Cool.
I'm with you.
All right, we're moving along. So here's an example. We run that command, and the CLI is always going to tell us what files it affected and how it affected them. So here we can see that it created the hello world.html file. And if we were to inspect that on the next line down, we would see that it generated a title tag with hello Houston. And so we also want to touch a little bit on unit tests. So we can run these manually, do the manual verification, but you also can run and build a full suite of unit tests for your schematics. So these you'll see on this line here, the schematic test runner. These are provided for you, so you don't have to create that yourself. But there's lots of examples. The Angular CLI source code is a great place to find examples on unit testing and how to do things, and obviously lots of other libraries. But you'll essentially create a runner and then create a tree. And here we're just doing a very simple test where we're creating an empty tree. We're running our schematic called hello world. And then we're expecting that tree only has 1 file. And so you can go much more in depth. You can inspect the actual file itself, look for certain variables, position, all those sorts of things as well. But you can build a full suite of unit tests for your schematic as well. All right.
Okay, cool. All right, I'm up. Any questions as we kind of went through the hello world example there?
No, I think we've still got everybody online watching, but we're just following along with you.
Awesome. So now let's kind of circle back and.
Oh wait, we do have a comment. It's not a question, it's a comment. But
Oh.
but I forgot. It was like 10 minutes ago, and I didn't say anything because it was just a comment. But Anbar said we have a Russian Texan who's our buddy, and he said that he really enjoyed your podcast on adventures in Angular. I think about this, and so he's digging it because now he actually gets to see the visual presentation instead of just listening to it. So shout out from the Russian Texan.
Glad to have you here. That's very cool. Yeah. Okay, so now like we've dived in a little bit, right? We've done kind of a shallow dive. We've taken a look at this hello world where we're just creating a simple file. It's got that simple option for the name. So now let's kind of circle back and come back to that idea of actually creating something that's usable, right? So this is still kind of maybe potentially for you if you're out there listening or watching is like, I'm still not sure about the why. Like, so this is where we're going to actually create this container component, right? And the idea here is we want to be able to just run ngg container component, just like you kind of saw in the beginning with the demo. And so now let's actually take a deeper dive and let's actually start looking at how we're going to make this happen. And so the first thing we need to understand is that there's this concept of like templates or files in the Angular schematics, right? So inside of our source directory, inside of our schematic, we're going to create a directory called files, and that's just the default, and you can override that, I'm pretty sure. But by default, you're going to have a directory called files, and then in there is where you're going to have all these templates, right? So when I created that container component earlier and we saw all that Angular code, right? I don't want to have like all this code in my schematics. It'd be really nice if I just already had like a template file, kind of like if you've done any sort of templates for like maybe back in the day, if you did full stack or back-end development, we might have like pug templates or whatever it is, right? You're creating these templates and then you're going to fill in the details later. It's a lot easier than trying to like code it all out, right? And so we're going to do the same thing with schematics. We're going to have these files, and then inside there, I'm going to have a CSS file. I'm going to have a TS file for my component. I'm going to have an HTML file for my template, and a spec file for my test, right? And I'm going to use kind of a very simple syntax to basically do string interpolation inside of those files to substitute into places where I want like the name of the class, right? So if we go back, even if we go back to this example that we were looking at, the name of the class of the component is Houston component, right? And I've got my prefix of app, and then I do Houston lowercase, right? And because those were provided by the user. And the name of my file is houston.component, right? And so we're going to create templates inside, and I can show you. Let's collapse this up and go into source. And if we look inside of our files directory, the names of these files are kind of funny, right? Because they also have like string interpolation happening here, where I'm going to take that name option and dasherize it, or not even have a directory if it's flat. The flat option is specified as true. And then I might have like an extension for my style sheet, right? But you can see that I've got these template files. And if I go to this TypeScript file, this is going to look a lot like what we would expect it to look like, but then there's also kind of this funky template syntax happening around it, right? So here I'm outputting the selector, and then I have an if statement. So if I'm going to do an inline template, then I'm going to have a template property in my decorator, the object for the component decorator. If I'm doing view encapsulation, then I'm going to import this. There's also this idea of dasherizing things. So I'll dasherize whatever the name is. And then I can also classify. So that would do like upper camel case for, class, because you would expect it to be, an upper camel case class name. So you can kind of see this is what our template looks like. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use these templates. And we're going to have to wire some things up first, right? Like those different options, like whether you're using view encapsulation or inline style. So we got to kind of wire some stuff up. But then eventually we're going to use a function called template, which is very well named. And we'll use that template function, and we're going to tell it, go ahead and run against our templates and do all these substitutions and stuff for us. So that's what our files kind of look like. And let me jump back to the presentation. Okay. So I already mentioned some of these functions, but here's a full list just in case you're kind of curious. We can decamelize, dasherize, camelize, classify, underscore, capitalize, and those are all provided for us in this strings file, I think it's called. And so we'll use that in order to kind of run all those functions against those strings. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at our index file. So this is where we're going to actually start building out this schematic. This is going to look, or this should look pretty much the same as what Kevin showed with the Hello World example. The only difference is rather than name you the function, I've actually just exported a default function out. And then back in your Schema JSON file, you can actually omit that like pound function name, right? And you just point it right to our index file. And here we've got our factory function that's going to return our function that accepts the host and the context. And we've got a couple of things we need to do. First, we need to validate and configure all the options that the user specified. Next, we need to copy those files over and generate out the templates. And then finally, we're going to kind of put it all together and chain it all up. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with kind of figuring out all the options that the user specified. And you're going to notice that we're going to be using the Angular JSON file in order to figure out some of these options. So the first thing I need to do is I need to get the project configuration from the Angular JSON file. So first I need to make sure that you've specified what project, and if you haven't, I'm going to throw an exception. And then I'm going to go ahead and invoke get project, and then this comes out of the Schematics Angular utility directory. And then using get project, I actually get an object back called a workspace project. And then I can use that to get information about your project. And when I say project, you can think app, but remember in workspaces, we can also have libs, right? So a project could be either an app or a lib, right? And so underneath that project, we've got information about that application or that library, like its selector, right? The next thing we need to do is we need to figure out where we're actually going to generate out these components, right? So we need to figure out the path. So if you haven't specified the path, we're going to use this function called build default path. And again, we're going to use these helper functions rather than writing all this code ourselves. And this also comes out of the Schematics Angular utility folder. The next task that we kind of have in getting everything wired up and ready to go is we need to figure out what module we're going to be using this component in, right? So if you're familiar with the Angular CLI, you know that when I generate out a component, it actually kind of traverses up the tree from the destination of where I'm generating that component, and it tries to find the nearest module, right? And then once it finds that module, it'll add that class into the declarations array, right? And import it as well, right? And so we're going to use, again, another helper function that comes out of the Schematics Angular utility directory called find module from options. And then we'll go ahead and give it the host and then all of our options that we've got so far. And then that's going to return the module for us. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to normalize all of our paths and names. So this is, if you're kind of confused, like, what do you mean by normalize? Basically, the simplest example is like Windows versus Mac OS or Linux, right? So, dealing with forward slashes and backslashes and all that kind of stuff. So we'll use this parse name function. Again, that's kind of a helper function that we've got provided by Schematics. And we'll give it the path and the name, and then we'll get back out kind of these normalized names and paths. And now we need to go ahead and get our selector. Remember in the example, it was app. That's the default, as you probably know when you ng new an application. But you can change the selector to be, ABC or whatever kind of maybe goes along with your project or the name of your code or whatever you're kind of calling it, right? So if you're not using app, we want to figure out what that selector is. And we're going to get that out of the angular.json file. And we'll use this build selector function to do that. And now that we've kind of we've collected all the pieces that we need to know in order to build out these templates, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to use two functions, apply and URL. URL, as kind of implies, is it's going to accept a path or a URL, if you will, to wherever the files is. And this is where you could customize it if you don't call that directory files, right? And then using that URL, we're going to pass that into apply. And what apply is going to do is it's going to apply a series of operations to the templates in that directory, right? And so that's why we've got an array, because that's going to be each of the steps that kind of get applied. And so the first thing we want to do is we're going to filter out some of the files. So if you did like no spec, which I hope you're not doing, but if you are generating out components and using the no spec flag, right, we don't actually want to, we don't deal with that spec file that was in my template in my files directory. So I'm just going to filter that out. And the same is true with a style file or the template HTML file, right? So if you're doing inline styles or inline template, we want to go ahead and just filter those out. So that way we're not doing anything with those files and they don't get written out to your file system. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to kind of compile those templates like we talked about, doing all those, running all those functions like dasherize and providing all the options. And then finally, we're going to move those files to wherever that destination is or that path. So I'm not going to dive through everything here, but you can see basically what we're doing is we're using two functions. We're using a no-op function and we're using a filter function. And all that's going to do is that's going to allow us to say, if you said that you want a spec file, then just don't do anything. So just no-op. Otherwise, let's go ahead and run the filter function. And then for each file, give that path. And then as long as the path doesn't end with spec.ts, then it'll get included, right? And we're going to do the same thing with the style sheet and with the template. Okay, so now that we've got the files that we want to actually work with, now we're ready to go ahead and invoke that template function that I talked about earlier, right? So we're going to invoke template, and we're going to give it those strings. That's the all those kind of string functions, and then all of our options as well, right? And so that's going to actually take all those values that are in our options object and those string functions, and it's going to go through all the files for us and apply that template to it, right? And then the last thing we want to do is we want to move those files into that path, using the normalize path string. And then the last thing we want to do is we want to apply any, and this is something that the CLI does. So whenever we're generating out a component, if we've got any sort of like custom lint fix rules, we're going to do that after we've run the template and moved the files. So now what we're going to do is at the end, we're going to use this chain function to chain together all of our template files, and then we're going to apply any sort of lint fixing that we want to, if that is specified. So that's how we do it. That's how we're going to build out a custom component, a container component, using schematics. Kevin, you ready? You want to talk about how we're going to use the sandbox approach to do this?
Let's do it.
Do we have any questions, Bonnie, as I kind of went through building out the container component?
Chris wanted to know if we could get the presentation deck
Yep.
and send that out. And Chris, I don't know if I can, I try not to email because I don't want to spam people, but what we can do is email or tweet out a link to it. So if you're following NG Houston on Twitter, then you will get that. And I can probably figure out how to add it to the description below in the YouTube. But we can definitely tweet it. That's super easy.
Yeah, absolutely.
If that's okay with YouTube.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think the error handling should say, Houston, we have a problem.
That's good. I like that. That's really good. Nice.
I get a kick out of myself. Okay, so Sandbox.
All right, Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah. So there's probably at least one of you out there who's like, yeah, this all sounds great. I think I know what's going on, but I need to see this in action. Like, what are we talking about here? There's abstract syntax trees. There's also a tree within our schematic. I need to see this thing in action, and I want to develop this in a way that lets me incrementally see the changes to my file system. So
that was me.
Yeah, this is for you.
At least one of us, probably more.
Yeah, well, this was me too when I started this. I was like, I need to see this in action before I can wrap.
I want to see the observable part. Yeah, I was really excited about that, and I keep bugging you about it.
Yep. So we have a list of resources here with some links. One of those that's on there, I believe, there's a great article by Hans, who wrote kind of a getting started article, and he kind of pieced some of this together on this idea of a sandbox. And I kind of took that and packaged it up with some scripts to make it really easy, just a couple NPM or Yarn scripts that you can run. And what I kind of found myself wanting to do, like I said, was I've got the schematic code, and I just started real simple, just make this file change or just add this file, right? But I wanted to be able to repeatedly do that as I was developing and making changes, and say, what is the difference between this application with this structure, maybe like these two modules and these components, and when I apply it, what does it look like? What's the difference? Like, what are the file changes? I didn't want to have to keep clicking around and going through finding the files and looking at the differences and whatnot. So one thing that I kind of came up here with Breebug was this idea of a sandbox. And so what we're going to do here is within our schematic repository, I generally create a directory called Sandbox. You can call it whatever you want. And inside that, I run ng new and then just give it an app name. So you can call it Sandbox app or whatever you want. And that's going to spec out just a default, ng application for whatever version of the CLI that you have. And generally then I will commit that to my repository. And what that's going to allow us to do is execute the schematic and then use our editor's, Git or version control tool to easily see what files we change and how we changed them. So you'll be able to, like Brian was saying, we'll reset the directory to the version controlled state, then we'll execute the schematic, and then we'll be able to see a diff against that sandbox folder. So we can separate between what are our schematic changes and what are our sandbox testing changes. So in order to do that, we will want to use Yarn or NPM linking, depending on what you're doing. So you'll link your schematic source code on your computer, and then you'll CD into your sandbox, whatever you called it, and then run link in there as well. And so those will kind of join the two together, so that this final script that you'll execute kind of as your execution script, when you run ngg, and then you'll pass your local schematic collection name and the schematic itself, it will essentially run the schematic that is in your parent directory there. And so that gives you kind of a quick feedback cycle to make changes, and then you can run, you can set this up however you want, but set it up in kind of a one-liner, NPM script that will, do a clean reset to head. It will build, it'll execute, and then you can, run a series of tests after that if you want. So it just gives you a nice way to develop this over time and see just a visual representation of your schematic. You can think of this kind of like an end-to-end test, if you will. You can execute this live on your file system and see that one-liner script, a series of test scripts. So I generally will do, like and within that sandbox application, I'll run ng build, ng test, ng lint. I'll do a prod build, run the end-to-end test. You can do any number of tests to make sure that your schematic doesn't break the application that you're applying it against. So like I said, we have a resource slide that will obviously get tweeted out, and in there's a repository that I made called Schematic Starter, and that you can fork that, and there's a couple examples in there, but it has the scripts that'll let you kind of one-line all this stuff together, as well as a couple examples, just so you can download it, run it locally, and see a schematic working on your machine.
Awesome.
Cool. Brian's going to talk about some resources.
Okay. So you might be thinking, all right, well, this is great. How do I get started? And I think the best way to get started, certainly I think, studying some of the source code in the CLI, or studying source code in the material repo, I think that's certainly valuable. But one of the easiest ways to kind of get started is using the Schematic CLI. They've got a schematic called Schematic. So if you run Schematics Schematic and then give it a name, that'll actually create out a new project for you with a bunch of demo schematics in there. I want to say there's like 3 or 4, and it kind of does like what we did. Like first it starts with like a hello world, like a very simple schematic, and then the next one is a little bit more advanced. It kind of builds on top of each other. Blog articles and definitely Hans's article on the Angular.io website was just studying this code. So you run this command, and it gives you a bunch of code, and it's all like commented and that kind of thing. So you can kind of follow through and say, oh, okay, this is how it works. This is how I piece this all together. So that's definitely a great place to start. Is to start with this sample schematic that gets provided by the CLI. Other than that, we certainly would recommend, check out some of the repositories that we've got here that both myself and Kevin have created. I've got the Hello World schematic repository, which is that first one, and that was that first one that Kevin walked us through. Schematics, the second link on here, that's the container component. Maybe it's not the best name for a repository, but that's the container component schematic. And you can look at that source code and see how I did it. The next one I have on here is I actually wrote a schematic to ng-add Angular Fire to an Angular project. And that's open source. And it's also on NPM. So you can just run ng-add Angular-Fire-Schematics, and that'll install Angular Fire into your Angular application and do some configuration for you. So you're welcome to kind of look at the source code for that as well. And then we've got the link to Hans's article, the schematics and introduction that he wrote. And then certainly take a look at how the CLI uses schematics. Take a look at how Material uses schematics. You can see there's actually a couple of functions in the Material repository, some like helper utility functions that are not in the CLI that you might find helpful to do things. I'm trying to think of which one I used in there, but there's a couple in there that are helpful. So if you're kind of starting to develop a schematic and you're like, whoa, seems really hard to do, whatever it is, I would certainly recommend that you go out and look how the Angular team's doing that, whether that's the Angular Material team or the CLI team. Take a look at how they're kind of solving some of those problems. And they might have already solved the same problem that you're running into, and then you can just bring that utility function over to your project and use it. And then the last one here is the one that Kevin just mentioned, his schematic starter. He blogged about that as well. We can get you that link where he kind of talks about using this schematic starter repository that you can fork, and then you can use that to already have a sandbox and some of those scripts set up for you in your package JSON. So. And with that, that's what we've got. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Bonnie, for allowing us to come on and talk about schematics. Certainly would open up the floor for any questions or any feedback or anything that you guys got for us.
Thank you so much for coming on and teaching us. This is really great. We have a couple schematic shows on every once in a while. We kind of want to keep up with all the latest, but it's really good to have like a comprehensive start to finish guide. So all in one place. This is very, very cool. Our Russian Texan friends said thank you for being a fabulous, informative presentation. And I think you guys are awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. I was going to say, where should they go if they want to learn more? But you included that in the last slide. So that's pretty perfect.
Yeah,
I don't think, go ahead.
I was gonna say, and I'll tweet, if you follow me, I'll tweet out a link to the slides as well. And you can get a hold of these, and all those repositories are all public, so.
Well, I know I definitely follow you, and everybody should follow you. Brian_love and Kevin Schuchard.
Yep.
Which is definitely not spelled the way it's pronounced, but it's pretty easy once you know how to pronounce it. Okay, so thank you so much. And are you guys going to be at an evening of Angular in a couple weeks?
Yes, we will.
You're gonna be there? I'm so excited. I'm going to see you guys. I love Denver.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to having you. Is Samantha coming out with you?
Yes.
Awesome.
Absolutely. She loves Denver too. We're trying to get my husband to move there.
Yeah.
We went there for Angular Denver, and we had so much fun.
Yeah. No, No, it's a great city, and I think you've got you coming out, and I think we've got a total of 5 GDEs that are going to be speaking. I know Lucas Rubelki, Kim. I don't know if is
we have. I'm trying to think of who. I don't remember off the top of my head. Oh, Mike and Brandon, the NGRX guys.
Yeah, Mike and Brandon, NGRX core team. How did I forget about them? I'm so sorry.
I can't believe you. I'm going to tell them. No, I'm just kidding. And also, we're going to have Hudson Baker, who is my friend from Denver. He actually was down. I met him down here in Houston not that long ago. Your screen share is still on. You should turn your screen share off so we can.
Oh, that's all right. I was looking up. Here's who we've got coming out. I can turn it off. How do I do this?
Yeah.
All right, cool.
There you go. There you go.
Cool.
Okay, so we have me and Sam, Mike and Brandon. We have Kim. We have Lucas, Matt Vaughn, and Hudson Baker are going to be there. And you guys are going to be there. And Jesse Sanders is going to be there.
Yep.
We're going to have so much fun.
It's going to be awesome.
And there are still tickets available.
There are. That's right. So it's $25, I think, to join us. We're also selling
$25.
It's $25 for the night. Yep.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and that just really honestly is like we have to charge like a little bit, just like because we're renting out like a movie theater where they would normally be showing a movie, and so we rent out the theater, and then we also will have a bunch of snacks and food, and so
that's basically just enough to cover the expenses.
You got it. Yeah. And then
and plus y'all are flying people in.
We are. And I think this is the case. I hope I'm not misspeaking, but we did this last time. If we make any profit off of it, we actually just turn around and donate that to a tech organization here in Denver that works with kids and technology and STEM, right? So we're not looking to get anything out of this. We're looking to just have a great evening, have a ton of fun, talk about Angular. We love bringing in, honestly, like big names like you and Mike and Brandon. And like people love you guys here in Denver, and they want to meet you. They want to ask questions. They want to get to kind of get to know people that maybe they're seeing it at NGConf up on stage, and they just don't get a chance to meet them. So
well, we're coming. We're coming to Denver. I've got our plane tickets. We're all descending on Denver in like 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks. I'm super excited.
Yeah, January 17th.
Yeah.
So
absolutely. You guys are so fun. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And Jesse's going to be on the show in a couple weeks. And I'm super excited about that.
I know he is. What is he talking about? I forget. Do you know?
I don't remember. I told him to come on and show us something cool. He's probably talking about Cypress, I think, because that's the new thing lately.
He's been loving Cypress. Cypress is awesome. So
you know what? We have not had a Cypress episode yet, so I'm crossing my fingers that he is talking about Cypress, because that would be super cool. We haven't had Jesse on the show in a while, so I'm excited.
Otherwise, he's going to be like, "Thanks a lot. You just signed me up for Cypress."
Yeah. So we will have him on the show soon. We will be in Denver soon, and we're going to see you guys. It's going to be awesome. And thank you again so much, both of you, for coming on the show. This was a great presentation, and I really appreciate you guys taking the time to put that together.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Bonnie. Take care.
Great.
See you guys.
Have a good night.